A group of boys perform on a stage. When it's over, they stand together and wait while someone else decides if they were good enough. A screen lights up, a ranking appears, and they find out where they stand. That was ILAND. But it's also every music show win announcement, every chart placement, and every album release week since debut. The show ended in 2020, but the loop of it all didn't. And that might be the part no one fully grasps. ILAND was designed to be temporary. You walk in, you compete, and if you're good enough, you walk out the other side with the debut. There were judges, rankings, and every few episodes, a screen displayed the results in front of everyone. You didn't find out privately. You stood in a line next to the people you'd been living with and learned what everyone thought of you. The ones at the bottom packed their things and left, while the rest watched. It stretched across 113 days, but there was always a fixed endpoint. Episode 12. 7 names get called. The whole thing wraps up. But what ILAND actually did to the people inside it went deeper than just deciding who debuted. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about ENHYPEN just like this, consider subscribing. The system was built so that surviving meant hurting someone else. The trainees had to vote each other in or out. Jake performed alongside Sunwoo and a third trainee, but only Jake and Sunwoo made it through. The third one didn't. They'd practiced together, performed together, and now 2 of them walked forward, while the other would inevitably walk out. That kept happening every few episodes, and every time it cost more, because the longer you spent with someone, the harder it became to raise your hand against them. Out of everyone on ILAND, Jay might have had the roughest go of it. Early on, he tried out for a singing part he really wanted, and he couldn't land it, so he went for the next one, though he couldn't land that one either. However, instead of stopping, he just kept trying, part after part, failing every single time while everyone watched. Eventually, he just said he'd take whatever was left. He later called it the most humiliating moment in his 3 years as a trainee, and it happened in just the 2nd episode. After they performed, he was voted out and sent to the ground. He told everyone he'd come back like nothing happened, and he actually did. But even after making it back, he lost his part again and got shuffled around. And then in episode 10, right before one of the final global votes, Jay did something that really shows us everything that the system does to you. He sat down and wrote goodbye letters to every single member. He practiced off to the side, alone, just in case his name wasn't called. He was getting ready to lose while still doing everything he could do to stay. 5 years later, that same person would stand on a stage in the California desert and tell the crowd he was having the time of his life. But in 2020, that version of Jay didn't exist yet, and that feeling never really went away after the show ended. The feeling where things might be going fine, but you still can't shake the sense that it could all fall apart at any moment. That's what the system did to you. You never felt safe enough to stop bracing for the worst, even when things were going well. Then the show ended, and they were out. ILAND was over. That's how debut felt, like a finish line. Like everything that came before it had been building to this one moment, and now that it was here, the hardest part was over. ENHYPEN debuted in November 2020 with Give and Taken. They showed off new music, new stages, and took on a career that didn't come with rankings or eliminations, or the constant feeling of standing in a line wondering if today was the day you'd be sent home. For a little while, that's probably what it felt like the system was behind them. And then a few months passed, and something about it all started to feel familiar. May 2021, ENHYPEN were backstage at a music show when the nominees were listed. The MCs paused, and their name was called. They'd won their first trophy for Drunk Dazed. Sunghoon said later that he honestly didn't expect them to win. They were all shocked, hugging each other, and Heesung even cried. It was genuinely an emotional moment for them. They'd worked for it, and they got it. And for however long that feeling lasted, it was everything. But then they won again, and then a third time. And each time the win felt a little less like a reward, and a little more like a standard they'd have to live up to the next comeback. On ILAND, you performed, got judged, and found out where you stood. But after debut, the format was identical. You release an album, and then you enter a window where everything is being counted. First day sales, first week sales, chart positions, music show scores. Did you beat your last comeback? Did you beat the group next to you? The structure of it is the same, and you stop calling it a survival show, but you certainly are still surviving. The group grinding through all that would eventually hit number 2 on the Billboard 200, but during those early comeback cycles, none of that was guaranteed. And the thing is, the way they survive hasn't really changed either. 6 of the 7 ENHYPEN members were chosen through global fan votes on ILAND. The public decided who made it and who went home. After debut, that same force is still the thing keeping them alive. It just shows up differently. Album sales come from fans buying the music. Music show wins come from fans voting. The brand deals they land, things like Tiffany & Co. and Prada, only happen because enough people know who they are. Tour dates only get booked if there's enough demand to fill the venues. And underneath all of it, the company's decision to keep investing in them, to give them bigger budgets, better stages, more creative freedom, all of that depends on whether the public is still paying attention. On ILAND, someone at the very least told you when you were eliminated, but in the industry itself, your support just starts shrinking until you're no longer a topic at all. Their first album set huge records for a debut group, and that should have felt like a win. But what it actually did was set a number that the second album had to beat. And when the second album did beat it, that became the new expectation of success. Every comeback after that entered the same cycle. Release, watch the numbers, see where you land. Except the bar kept rising because you were the one who set it. On ILAND, the pressure came from trying to survive elimination. After debut, they had to fight to survive in the industry. Fight to prove they've earned a spot and won't just be some trend. However, the time between comebacks wasn't entirely rest. They were constantly preparing for the next one. During their Dark Blood promotions, they were running on back-to-back days of shoots and pre-recordings with hardly any sleep. By the time Orange Blood came around, Heesung was walking into a pre-recording at 5:15 in the morning, saying he felt sorry because Engine must have arrived even earlier just to see them, and that even he was feeling tired. 1 week of promotions would end, and their schedule would simply switch up to something else, like filming N-O'Clock or participating in brand sponsorships. During one of those stretches, Jay showed up to a pre-recording after 1 hour of sleep, still struggling with jet lag. He was still trying to fight it off from traveling, and the schedule didn't care. He had to be there, so he was. While he was in the green room, he looked to the side of the camera and said,
21년 인생에서 느낀 단 한 가지의 삶의 정석. 사람은 잠을 자야 된다.
Jungwon went on to jokingly add that Jay could sleep with his eyes open, that he was probably sleeping right now while talking. But what Jay actually said was kind of strange if you think about it. He was 21 years old, and the biggest lesson he'd taken from his life so far was that people need sleep. Not something about fame or sacrifice or what it takes to make it, just that people need sleep, and that his life didn't give him enough of it. Back on ILAND, when he was voted to the ground, he took on a leadership role almost immediately. He led the practice sessions, and when the other grounders were visibly exhausted, he pushed them to keep going. Everyone is tired and exhausted, but we have to keep going because of time. He understood something the others hadn't fully accepted yet. The system wasn't going to slow down because you were tired. It was going to keep moving, and the ones who couldn't keep up with it were going to be the ones who didn't make it through. ILAND filtered for the people who could function inside that kind of pressure. Not the most talented ones, necessarily. The ones who could take the exhaustion, the uncertainty, and the constant evaluation. The 7 who made it out were the 7 who proved they could do that for 113 days straight. And after debut, their schedules were demanding them to do the exact same thing. And this time around, there wasn't a promised success point. A finish line, if you will. You finish promoting one song and then get straight to work on the next one. Every group they're competing against is also running on no sleep, also doing back-to-back pre-recordings and early morning tapings and squeezing practice in between. When everyone around you is already giving everything they have, the moment you ease up is the moment you start falling behind. At least on Island, you knew when the evaluations were happening. There was a consistent schedule here. The producers would gather everyone and you'd perform knowing this was the moment being scored. You could brace for it. You knew when to make it count. After debut, that barrier didn't exist anymore. A fan cam of you could go viral, and suddenly that's how people are judging your stage presence. An airport appearance gets clipped and reposted by thousands of people who weren't there. A behind-the-scenes moment that was never supposed to be serious gets frozen online and picked apart by strangers. On Island, at least the cameras were part of the deal. Everyone knew they were being filmed and when. Out in the wild world that is the K-pop industry, the cameras were just always there, and people were always watching. But if Island really did filter for the people who could survive inside a system like this, then what happens when they struggle to live in it? In 2025, Jay was doing a live stream, just talking to fans, nothing crazy. Though his phone kept ringing, the same caller over and over, cutting into a moment that was supposed to be his. However, the person calling was a stalker of his, not someone he knew. He eventually told them they were wasting time he could have spent communicating with his fans, and that if it happened again, he'd put the call on speaker. Jay wasn't on a stage. He wasn't waiting for chart numbers or sitting through a music show announcement. He was just trying to talk to his fans, and someone from the outside kept calling his phone over and over, cutting into a moment that was supposed to be his. The stalker fan had followed him into a space that should have belonged to him, and all he could do was try and deal with it right there in front of everyone. On Island, there was at least a wall between being watched and not being watched. You knew when the cameras were on, and there were places you could go to get away from them entirely. After debut, that wall got thinner and thinner, and 5 years in, even something as simple as a live stream with fans wasn't really just that anymore. By the time Dark Blood came around in 2023, the weight behind everything had changed. This wasn't early career ENHYPEN just trying to prove they belonged. Jungwon, the same person who once called debut the last destination, said he felt this album needed to become a turning point for the team. Jake said that, as artists, there isn't one visible standard of success, so you have to keep steadying your will over and over again. All 7 of them had bet their lives on this, as they say. That's certainly not the language of someone who escaped a system. That's more so the language of someone deep inside one. Except now the expectations aren't coming from a judging panel. They're coming from ENHYPEN's own track record, from their fans and from themselves. But what's interesting is that even though the pressure had changed, the places they were in hadn't. During Dark Blood promotions, ENHYPEN went to M Countdown, the same building where the final episode of ILAND took place. As they were getting ready, Jungwon pointed it out. This is the green room we used for the last episode of ILAND. 3 years later, they won first place there for the first time. And around that same time, during a different music show taping, Sunghoon said something that kinda captured everything about how far they'd come. He'd been visiting music banks since his days as an MC there, long enough that the hallways and green rooms had become second nature to him. And when someone asked him how it felt being back, he said that of all the TV stations they visit, this place feels most like home. These are the same kinds of buildings where idols get scored every week, where you stand on a stage and wait to hear if your name gets called. The same format that ILAND was built on, and the word Sunghoon used to describe it was home. Like the system that used to feel like a threat had just become part of his life, and he was okay with that. And Heesung, wrapping up the same cycle, said he wished they could have performed more. The thing that used to be something he needed to get through had become something he didn't want to end. And then Coachella happened, for a full month before the show. And ENHYPEN did something they'd never really gotten to do on ILAND. They built the entire performance themselves. They rented out a practice studio, brought in dancers and a live band, and went through every single detail together. Jake would stop the room to walk the dancers through a formation, and he suggested they shift one of his moves to the second beat because it looked cleaner that way, and they tried it out right there on the spot. When something didn't feel right between songs, they talked it through as a group until it did. Jake had pushed really hard to include Moonstruck in the setlist. He said that the moment he heard it with the live band and drums, he just knew it had to be part of the show. He pushed for it pretty strongly and managed to convince the members. They reworked Drunk Dazed into a completely different EDM arrangement. They adjusted how loud the in-ears needed to be so that they could actually hear themselves over the band. Every single piece of that set was something they touched. However, their time on Island was very different. They didn't get to do any of that. Back in episode 2, Heesung tried to adjust part of the choreography for the performance. He thought it could be better, but the other trainees pushed back. They worried it was risky, that they should stick to what they were given. Eventually, the whole group sat down to talk about it, and Heesung stepped back. He gave up the part, isolated himself, and kept practicing alone. He wasn't entirely wrong about wanting to make a change, but the system didn't really leave room for that kind of creative input. You performed what was handed to you, and you hoped it was enough. At Coachella, 5 years later, they were the ones handing things to themselves. They chose the setlist. They directed the dancers. They designed the transitions. The loop was the same as it had always been. Perform and get judged and find out where you stand. But for the first time, the thing they were being judged on was something they had fully built from the ground up. On the day of the first show, Jungwon walked through the empty venue before the crowd arrived. He stood at the Sahara stage, looked out at the massive overhang and the open desert stretching out past the field, and all he said was, "This is gonna be fun. This is insane." Backstage, right before they went on, Jake told everyone to stay calm. Sunghoon added that they've done stadiums in a lot of other shows before. They felt confident they'd do great because they had leaned into the loop more. Then they performed for a crowd that spilled across the field, while a live stream carried it to hundreds of thousands more. The loop they were inside of had grown to a huge scale, and after week 1, they were already thinking about what to fix. I feel like I could have done more, so I'll do better in week 2. When it finally rolled around, they felt different. Jay said it had been tough at times and taken a long time to prepare, but that he was glad it turned out well. Heesung watched the crowd react to the Drunk Dazed rework and said he felt like a DJ. The same industry loop that began in Island was still running through all this. Perform, get judged, find out where you stand. But nothing about the way they carried themselves looked like survival anymore. There was a point during all this that Jay started talking about the Eagles, how they'd been together for over 50 years, how they were on what might be their final tour, still performing the same songs they wrote decades ago. And what got to him wasn't necessarily how long they'd lasted, it was the way their performances made you feel the weight of all that history, like every show carried everything that came before. He said that was the kind of thing that really moved him, and that he wanted to keep singing even when he grew old. This is the same person who sat in Island writing goodbye letters to his friends because he didn't think he'd make it to the next round. The same person who failed nearly every part audition in front of everyone and called it the worst moment of his life. The same person who showed up to a pre-recording on 1 hour of sleep because the schedule didn't care how tired he was. The same person whose live stream got interrupted by a stranger because the world wouldn't stop watching him even when he asked it to. After all of that, Jay's dream wasn't to get out. It wasn't to find something easier, or quieter, or less demanding. His dream was to still be doing this 50 years from now. To be the old guy on stage whose performances carry the weight of everything he's been through. The system didn't break him. It didn't even make him bitter. It just became the place where the thing he loved most happened to live. And you know, that might be the answer for all of them. Island didn't necessarily end when they debuted. The rankings kept coming in, people kept evaluating, and they could never escape the cameras. But somewhere between the green room that used to scare them and the desert stage they built from scratch, ENHYPEN stopped trying to escape the loop and started making it their own. The show ended nearly 6 years ago, but the system it trained them for probably never will. However, they'll always try to make the best of it. If you want to see how ENHYPEN used their vampire concept to process what all this actually felt like from the inside, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.